Welcome to the Midnight Lesson. If you have ideas for future topics you want me to cover, leave them in the comments, because I'm always collecting suggestions for the next sleep-friendly lecture. Tonight, we're going to slow down and take our time with one of the most studied maritime disasters in history, the sinking of the RMS Titanic. We'll talk about the people involved, the tools and systems they relied on, the decisions made on the bridge and deep below deck, and the physics that turned a brief collision into a full-scale catastrophe. Get comfortable, let your eyes rest, and let's begin. Chapter 1. The World That Built Titanic. To understand why the Titanic sank, you have to first understand why she existed at all. Titanic was not built in a vacuum. She was built in a world obsessed with progress, prestige, and speed, where the North Atlantic Ocean was not just water between continents, but a commercial highway and a stage for national pride. In the early 20th century, the great shipping lines competed to build the most impressive passenger liners, and their rivalry shaped everything from ship size to interior design to the way safety was perceived. The RMS Titanic was an Olympic-class ocean liner, owned by the White Star Line and constructed by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, Ireland. White Star's business strategy differed slightly from its competitors. While the Cunard Line was famous for speed-focused ships like the RMS Lusitania and RMS Mauritania, White Star pursued a different kind of dominance, scale, luxury, and perceived stability. The goal was not necessarily to be the fastest across the Atlantic, but to provide a crossing that felt like a floating grand hotel, with calmness, elegance, and space. Titanic's construction was tied to an industrial system that was both modern and brutally physical. Harland and Wolff employed thousands of workers. The ship's hull was built from steel plates riveted onto a structural framework of beams and frames, with the work carried out by riveters, platers, drillers, fitters, and laborers, who handled heavy materials with cranes, pulleys, and sheer muscle. Shipbuilding in 1910 Belfast was dangerous, loud, and constant. The shipyard itself functioned like a city of machinery, with gantry cranes towering above the slipways and teams working in coordinated stages to assemble what would become one of the largest moving objects ever built. The keel of Titanic was laid on March 31, 1909. Her hull was launched on May 31, 1911, and she was fitted out over the following months, with interior spaces completed, machinery installed, and systems tested. Titanic was registered in Liverpool, England, and carried the prefix RMS, meaning Royal Mail Ship, because she held a contract to transport mail. That detail matters because it connects Titanic to the logistics infrastructure of the British Empire. She was not only a passenger ship, she was part of a communication network, carrying letters, packages, and official cargo. Titanic's dimensions were staggering for the era. She measured roughly 882 feet and 9 inches long, with a beam of about 92 feet and 6 inches. Her gross registered tonnage was over 46,000. These numbers are not just statistics. They represent a scale of mass and momentum that becomes essential later, because a ship that large cannot maneuver quickly, cannot stop quickly, and cannot recover easily once a large amount of seawater begins entering the hull. The propulsion system of Titanic combined old and new engineering approaches. She used two massive reciprocating steam engines, each driving one of the side propellers, plus a Parsons low-pressure steam turbine, driving the center propeller. Steam was generated by 29 boilers, housed across multiple boiler rooms, fed by coal-fired furnaces. This required constant labor. The ship carried roughly 6,000 tons of coal, and the act of converting that coal into motion required teams of stokers, firemen, and trimmers working in heat and soot deep below the waterline. These workers were part of the ship's engine department, led by Chief Engineer Joseph Bell. Bell and his team included senior engineers, junior engineers, and specialists responsible for maintaining the machinery, monitoring steam pressure, lubricating moving parts, and managing the electrical systems. Titanic was not simply driven by an engine. She was kept alive by an industrial workforce operating in shifts, in conditions that many passengers never saw and rarely thought about. On the surface, Titanic represented luxury. But beneath the surface, she was a coal-powered factory that happened to float. In terms of navigation and maritime technology, Titanic existed in an in-between era. She was modern enough to have wireless telegraphy, electric lighting, and advanced watertight subdivision, but she still relied heavily on human eyesight, manual calculations, and the assumptions of experienced seamen. Titanic's wireless system was operated by the Marconi Company, and the ship's wireless operators were employees of Marconi, not of White Star. This is a subtle but important detail because it affected priorities. Wireless operators were tasked primarily with handling passenger messages and ship communications, not serving as a dedicated emergency watch team for ice warnings. The wireless operators aboard Titanic were Jack Phillips and Harold Bride. Their tools included the Marconi transmitter, receiver, and associated equipment for sending Morse code signals across long distances. In 1912, this technology was powerful, but still developing in terms of protocol. Continuous 24-hour monitoring was not always practiced. Radio interference was common. Equipment could fail, and the workload could be intense, especially on a ship full of wealthy passengers sending personal messages to contacts in the United States. Titanic's most famous safety feature, at least in popular memory, was her watertight compartment system. She was divided into 16 major compartments separated by bulkheads, with watertight doors that could be closed from the bridge. The idea was straightforward. If one compartment flooded, the water could be contained, and the ship could remain afloat. The Titanic was designed to stay afloat with a certain number of compartments breached, depending on which compartments were involved. But the exact limits mattered. Titanic's bulkheads did not extend all the way up to the top decks. They rose only to specific deck levels. This design choice was common because fully extending bulkheads upward would have complicated internal access and ship layout. Yet it introduced a vulnerability. If water filled a compartment high enough, it could spill over the top of the bulkhead into the next compartment. In a progressive flooding scenario, this could turn multiple isolated leaks into a chain reaction. This is one of the core technical truths of Titanic's sinking. She did not need to be torn in half immediately. She only needed enough compartments opened in the wrong places, allowing the ship's own angle to defeat the compartment design. Another critical safety feature was the lifeboat system. And here Titanic reflected the assumptions of her time in a way that feels shocking today. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats total, 14 standard wooden lifeboats, 2 smaller cutters, and 4 collapsible Engelhardt boats. Combined, these had a capacity of roughly 1,178 people. Titanic carried more than 2,200 passengers and crew on her maiden voyage. Why would a ship carry lifeboats for only about half the people on board? The answer lies in regulation and mindset. British Board of Trade lifeboat requirements were outdated and based on tonnage categories that did not scale with the rapid growth of ship size. Titanic technically exceeded the legal minimum. More importantly, many in the industry believed lifeboats were not intended to carry everyone at once. They were viewed as ferries, meant to transfer passengers to a rescue ship nearby, under the assumption that a major liner route would always have other ships within reach. That assumption worked until it didn't. Titanic's captain was Edward John Smith, a veteran White Star Line commander with decades of experience. Smith was respected and widely known, and Titanic's maiden voyage was expected to be the crowning moment of his career. The ship's deck officers included Chief Officer Henry Tingle Wild, First Officer William Murdoch, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, Third Officer Herbert Pittman, Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, and Sixth Officer James Moody. Each of these men had specific roles related to navigation, watchkeeping, ship handling, and passenger safety. The structure of authority was strict. Decisions flowed from the captain and senior officers downward. In the passenger spaces, Titanic was built to impress. First-class cabins, dining saloons, smoking rooms, and lounges were designed with ornate woodwork, fine furnishings, and architectural grandeur. Titanic's famous grand staircase was not only functional but symbolic. It represented the idea that the ship was not merely transportation, but a refined environment meant to rival the best hotels of London or Paris. Second-class accommodations were comfortable and respectable, often equivalent to first class on many other ships. Third class, though far more basic, was still relatively clean and organized compared to older steerage standards. Many third-class passengers were immigrants traveling to the United States, often families or young adults, carrying hopes of work and stability. They were housed deeper in the ship, in compartments that were safe and practical but physically distant from the boat deck. By April 1912, Titanic stood at the intersection of confidence and limitation. She was advanced but not invincible. She was massive but not agile. She was filled with tools, but those tools depended on training, communication, and correct assumptions. She carried an elite crew and famous passengers, but also hundreds of ordinary people whose names would never appear in headlines. And perhaps most importantly, Titanic sailed at a time when the ocean was still stronger than human pride, and when safety culture had not yet caught up to engineering ambition. The disaster that followed would not simply be a story of an iceberg. It would be a story of systems, decisions, and physics, unfolding in darkness, in freezing air, on a sea that appeared calm right up until the moment it became deadly. In the next chapter, we'll follow Titanic from departure to open ocean, meet the key passengers and crew in more detail, and examine the tools and routines of a North Atlantic crossing, including wireless communications, ice warnings, and navigation practices that shaped what happened next. Chapter 2: Departure, Life, Onboard, and the Route into Ice. Titanic's maiden voyage began in a way that felt ceremonial, almost effortless, as if the ship itself was too large and too modern to be troubled by anything as ordinary as the sea. On the morning of April 10, 1912, the RMS Titanic departed from Southampton, England, one of the most important ports in the world for transatlantic travel. Southampton was not merely a departure point. It was an industrial gateway, built around docks, rail connections, coal supplies, and the complex choreography required to load a ship that carried thousands of people, tons of cargo, and a small city's worth of food and equipment. The commanding officer was Captain Edward John Smith, widely known as E.J. Smith, a veteran of the White Star Line. Smith was nearing retirement, and Titanic's maiden voyage carried a quiet symbolism, a final command aboard the most prestigious ship in the company's fleet. Beneath him, the ship's bridge and deck operations were structured by rank and duty. Chief Officer Henry Tingle Wilde served as the senior officer responsible for overall deck discipline and operations. First Officer William Mac Master Murdoch and Second Officer Charles Herbert Lightoller were responsible for navigation watches and the ship's immediate handling. Third Officer Herbert Pittman, Fourth Officer Joseph Boxall, Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, and Sixth Officer James Moody filled out the officer structure, each taking shifts and specific responsibilities that kept the ship running continuously, day and night. Titanic's first hours were already marked by a warning, though not the kind most people remember. As Titanic left Southampton, the ship's immense displacement and the movement of water created a suction effect that nearly caused a collision with the SS New York, a smaller vessel moored nearby. Lines snapped. The New York swung toward Titanic. For a moment it appeared the maiden voyage might end before it truly began. The incident was resolved with tug assistance, and Titanic continued, but it was an early reminder of scale and physics. A ship like Titanic did not move through the ocean passively. It reshaped the water around it. From Southampton, Titanic sailed to Cherbourg, France. Because Cherbourg's harbor could not accommodate a ship of Titanic's size directly at dock, passengers were ferried out to the ship by tender vessels. This was common practice, but it also reinforced Titanic's status. She was too large to be handled in ordinary ways. Cherbourg was a major embarkation point for wealthy passengers, and many first-class travelers boarded here, bringing luggage, servants, and the habits of a world where comfort was assumed. Titanic then proceeded to Queenstown, Ireland now known as Coe Beach. Queenstown was historically associated with emigration, and many third-class passengers boarded there, including individuals and families leaving Ireland for the United States. Titanic's passenger population was not a single social group, but an entire cross-section of early 20th century life. She carried the wealthy and the working class, the famous and the unknown, the secure and the desperate. The ship's decks were physically divided by class, and those divisions were not only social but architectural. The location of cabins, dining spaces, and stairways shaped movement, access, and eventually survival. The passenger list included some of the most recognizable names in Titanic history. John Jacob Astor IV, a businessman and member of one of America's most prominent families, traveled with his wife Madeline Astor, who was pregnant. Isidor Strauss, co-owner of Macy's department store, traveled with his wife Ida Strauss. Benjamin Guggenheim, part of the wealthy Guggenheim family, was aboard. Margaret Brown, later known as Molly Brown, traveled in first class. These names became famous because their stories were retold, but Titanic also carried hundreds of people whose lives mattered just as much, even if their names did not survive in popular memory. Second-class passengers included teachers, clergymen, professionals, and small business owners. Third-class passengers included immigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, Eastern Europe, and other regions, many traveling with limited resources and enormous expectations. For them, Titanic was not luxury. It was passage. It was the narrow bridge between an old life and a new one. The crew population was equally complex and, in many ways, more critical to understanding the ship's function. Titanic carried deck crew, engine crew, and victualling staff. The deck crew handled navigation, lookout duty, and boat operations. The engine crew maintained the boilers, engines, and electrical systems. The victualling staff, which included stewards, cooks, waiters, and cleaners, supported passenger comfort and the ship's daily routines. The ship could not operate without constant labor, and that labor was divided by department and hierarchy. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell led the engineering department. His team included senior engineers, junior engineers, and specialized workers who monitored gauges, valves, and steam pressure, ensuring that Titanic's propulsion remained steady. The boiler rooms required coal to be shoveled into furnaces continuously. Firemen worked in intense heat. Trimmers moved coal from storage bunkers to the boiler rooms, a job that was physically exhausting and dirty. These men were not visible to passengers in the dining rooms and lounges, but they were the reason the ship moved at all. Titanic's daily routine created a kind of floating normalcy. Meals were served at scheduled times. Passengers walked the decks, read books, wrote letters, played cards, and talked in lounges. The ship's interiors were designed to reduce the sensation of travel. Titanic was meant to feel stable, quiet, and controlled. That sense of control is one reason the disaster later felt so unbelievable. When you are surrounded by polished wood, electric light, and attentive staff, it becomes harder to imagine that the ocean is still in charge. In terms of tools and navigation practices, Titanic relied on a combination of human skill and mechanical instruments. Officers used compasses, charts, sextants, and chronometers to calculate position. Dead reckoning, the practice of estimating position based on speed and course over time, remained important. The ship's speed was measured and recorded. Lookouts were posted in the crow's nest, scanning the horizon for hazards. The ship's bridge crew maintained watch schedules, with officers rotating through shifts. At night, the ship depended heavily on eyesight, weather conditions, and warnings received by wireless. Wireless telegraphy was one of Titanic's most important technologies. The Marconi wireless system allowed the ship to send and receive messages across long distances, including communications with shore stations and other ships. Titanic's wireless operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, worked in the radio room handling passenger messages, operational reports, and navigational warnings. Their role was essential, but the way wireless was used in 1912 was not the same as modern emergency communications. There was no standardized global system for prioritizing ice warnings over passenger traffic. There was no universal rule requiring continuous monitoring of distress frequencies. The radio room could become overwhelmed with messages, and the operators could become exhausted. As Titanic moved into the open Atlantic, the ship followed a standard North Atlantic route. This route was designed to balance speed, efficiency, and safety, but it also carried ships into areas where ice could drift south from Greenland and Labrador. In April, icebergs were a known hazard. The cold Labrador current could carry ice far into shipping lanes, especially after winters that produced heavy ice conditions. During the voyage, Titanic received multiple ice warnings from other ships. The RMS Coronia sent a message about ice and bergs in the Titanic's path. The SS Baltic sent another warning, noting icebergs and large quantities of field ice. The SS America and the Mesaba sent additional warnings. These messages were not secrets. They were part of routine maritime communication. The question is not whether Titanic received warnings, but how those warnings were interpreted, prioritized, and acted upon. A particularly important message came from the Mesaba on April 14, describing heavy pack ice and numerous large icebergs in the area Titanic was approaching. This warning was specific and serious, yet in the workflow of the ship, it did not lead to a dramatic change in speed or course. Titanic continued at near her normal service speed. This decision was influenced by several factors, including confidence in the ship's size, the belief that ice could be avoided through lookout vigilance, and the standard practice of maintaining schedules. It is important to understand that in 1912, ships did not carry radar. They did not have satellite tracking. They did not have modern sonar scanning ahead of the vessel. Ice detection was human, visual, and dependent on conditions. On a night with waves, an iceberg might be easier to spot because waves break against its base, creating a white outline. On a calm sea, an iceberg can blend into darkness until it is dangerously close. Titanic's crew could not fully control this. They could only respond to what they saw when they saw it. The weather on April 14 became colder as Titanic moved west. The sea was calm, almost unnaturally smooth. The sky was clear, but there was no moon. This combination created a deceptive environment. A calm ocean looks safe. A clear sky looks safe. But darkness over calm water can hide hazards rather than reveal them. Without moonlight, the horizon can disappear into blackness, and an iceberg can appear only as a shadow, visible at the last moment. While passengers continued their routines, the ship entered a region where ice warnings were becoming more frequent. This is the quiet tension at the center of Titanic's story. The ship was moving into known danger, but the danger did not look like danger. It looked like a calm, cold night on a wide, empty sea. By the evening of April 14, Titanic's officers were aware that ice had been reported ahead. Lookouts were posted. The ship maintained course and speed. Wireless traffic continued. Passengers went to bed, attended social gatherings, or walked the decks in the cold air. The ship moved forward steadily, a controlled machine cutting through darkness. In the next chapter, we will slow down and examine the hours leading up to the collision in detail, including the specific ice warnings, the bridge watch structure, the actions taken by the lookouts and officers, and the exact moment when an iceberg emerged from the Black Atlantic directly in Titanic's path. Chapter 3. Ice Warnings, Lookouts, and the collision at 11:40 p.m. By the afternoon and evening of April 14, 1912, the Titanic was moving through a part of the North Atlantic that experienced mariners understood as complicated and seasonally dangerous. This was the region influenced by the Labrador Current, a cold southward flow that can carry sea ice and icebergs down from Greenland and the Canadian Arctic. Titanic was approaching the Grand Banks of Newfoundland, an area notorious not only for ice but also for fog, shifting weather, and heavy maritime traffic. In the era before radar, this combination made navigation a constant exercise in judgment. Titanic's navigation that day was handled through a structured watch system on the bridge. Officers rotated through shifts, and decisions about speed, course, and hazard response were shaped by both formal procedure and informal culture. Captain Edward John Smith remained the final authority, but like many captains, he relied on his officers to manage routine navigation while he oversaw the broader voyage. The ship was large, stable, and moving well. Nothing about the ship's physical behavior suggested imminent danger. That calmness was part of the trap. Wireless warnings about ice continued to arrive. These messages were received by Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, Titanic's Marconi wireless operators. Their station was not on the bridge, but in a separate radio room. They were responsible for sending and receiving Morse code transmissions, including passenger telegrams, operational messages, and hazard reports. Phillips, in particular, was dealing with an equipment issue earlier in the voyage that had created a backlog of passenger messages. This meant that on April 14, the radio room was busy, and the operators were working hard to clear accumulated traffic. Several ice warnings that day came from ships in the area. The RMS Coronia reported bergs, growlers, and field ice. The SS Baltic relayed information about icebergs and pack ice. The SS America sent warnings as well. But one of the most technically important messages came from the Mesaba. The Mesaba reported heavy pack ice and numerous large icebergs in the area directly ahead of Titanic's projected path. This was not vague. It was a broad, clear hazard map in words. In modern systems, such a message would trigger a formal risk response, including speed reduction, route adjustment, and continuous hazard monitoring. But Titanic's world operated differently. Ice warnings were treated as advisories, not emergency alarms. Ships had long crossed the North Atlantic in ice season. The expectation was that lookouts would spot hazards in time and the ship would maneuver. The sea itself, calm and dark, gave no visible reason to panic. Another critical message came from the SS Californian, a ship stopped for the night due to ice. Californian warned Titanic that it was surrounded by ice and had halted. This message was received by Phillips, who was busy and possibly frustrated by interruptions. At one point, Phillips responded sharply, telling Californian's operator to keep out because he was working Cape Race, the Newfoundland wireless station, and passenger traffic. This exchange became famous not because it was cruel, but because it shows how radio culture worked. Wireless was not yet treated as a dedicated safety service. It was treated as a communication tool, and the radio room had priorities that could conflict with navigational urgency. On the Titanic itself, the deck watch continued. As evening approached, the temperature dropped. The air became sharper, colder, and more still. The sea remained unusually calm. This detail is crucial. A calm sea can make icebergs harder to see. When waves strike an iceberg, they create white foam that can reveal its presence from a distance. When the ocean is flat, an iceberg can appear as a dark, low shape that blends into the horizon, especially under a moonless sky. At 10 p.m., Second Officer Charles Lightoller was on watch. Lightoller later testified that he warned the lookouts to be especially vigilant because the conditions were ideal for ice to be difficult to spot. Around this time, Captain Smith visited the bridge and discussed the ice situation. Smith then left, likely expecting that the watch officers would handle any developments. This was not negligence in the mindset of the era. It was normal command structure, but it placed enormous weight on the lookout system and the response time of the bridge. The lookouts in the crow's nest that night were Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee. They were positioned high above the deck, scanning forward. Their job was to detect hazards, including icebergs, and report them immediately. They had a bell to signal danger and a telephone connection to the bridge. Their tools were simple: eyesight, experience, and the ability to interpret shadows against darkness. One detail often discussed is binoculars. The lookouts did not have binoculars in the crow's nest that night. Whether binoculars would have helped is debated. Binoculars can narrow field of view, and in darkness they can reduce overall visibility. But the absence of binoculars became symbolic, a reminder that even small logistical details can become part of a disaster narrative. What matters most is that detection depended on visual contrast, and the contrast was poor. At approximately 11:40 p.m. ship's time, Fleet spotted an iceberg directly ahead. He struck the bell 3 times, the standard warning, and called the bridge. His message was immediate and clear: iceberg right ahead. The moment Fleet made that call, the timeline became brutally short. Titanic was moving at roughly 22 knots, meaning she was covering over 37 feet per second. At that speed, every second mattered. The ship's mass and momentum were enormous. The question was not simply whether Titanic could turn, but whether she could turn enough, fast enough, to avoid contact. On the bridge, First Officer William Murdoch was in charge of the watch. Murdoch's response was rapid. He ordered hard a starboard. This command, in the language of the time, meant the helm was turned to send the ship's bow to port, away from the iceberg. It is one of those confusing historical details where the command name reflects the tiller direction rather than the ship's heading change. Murdoch also ordered the engines stopped. There is debate over whether he ordered the engines reversed, but many accounts suggest that the ship's engines were slowed and possibly reversed in an attempt to reduce forward motion. At the same time, Murdoch ordered the watertight doors closed, a critical tool designed to isolate flooding. These doors could be activated from the bridge, dropping shut in the ship's lower compartments. The intention was to contain any damage below deck. This system worked in the sense that doors did close, but the number and location of breaches would soon overwhelm the design. Titanic began to turn. For a moment it may have seemed the ship would clear the iceberg. The bow swung away, and some accounts suggest that the very front of the ship missed the ice. But the ship's length worked against her. Titanic was not a short vessel pivoting quickly. She was nearly 883 feet long, and as the bow turned away, the midsection and stern still carried forward momentum along the original path. The iceberg struck along the starboard side, scraping the hull below the waterline. The collision did not feel like a dramatic crash to many passengers. It felt like a vibration, a shudder, a grinding sensation. Some described it as if the ship had run over something. Others felt almost nothing. This is another psychological trap. When a disaster begins quietly, people struggle to recognize it as disaster. There was no explosion, no immediate panic, no visible damage on deck. The iceberg itself passed into darkness. Below deck, the reality was immediate and violent. Water began pouring into the forward compartments. The iceberg had damaged multiple sections of the hull, opening the ship to the sea in a series of punctures and seams. The flooding was not a single hole in one place. It was spread across several compartments. This matters because Titanic could survive flooding in one or two compartments, possibly even more depending on which ones. But multiple adjacent compartments flooding meant that the ship's buoyancy was compromised across a large forward area. The ship's carpenter, James Hutchinson, and other crew members began checking the damage. In the boiler rooms, firemen and engineers encountered rising water. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell and his team were alerted. The engineers' role in the next 2 hours would be critical, because they would attempt to keep the ship's systems running, manage steam pressure, and maintain electrical power for as long as possible. Captain Smith was summoned to the bridge. When he arrived, he began gathering information. One of the most important people aboard was Thomas Andrews, the managing director of Harland and Wolff and Titanic's designer. Andrews had intimate knowledge of the ship's structure and safety limits. As he inspected the damage, he understood quickly that the ship was doomed. The iceberg had opened too many compartments. The watertight subdivision could not save Titanic if the forward compartments flooded beyond the bulkhead tops. This is where the sinking becomes a matter of mathematics as much as tragedy. Titanic's bulkheads did not extend to the uppermost decks. They rose to specific heights. As the forward compartments filled, the bow sank lower. As the bow sank, water rose higher in the forward compartments. Once water reached the top of a bulkhead, it spilled into the next compartment. Progressive flooding began. It was like a row of containers, each separated by a wall, but with the walls not tall enough. Once the water reached the lip, it flowed onward. Within a short time, Andrews reportedly gave Captain Smith a grim estimate. Titanic had perhaps 1 to 2 hours, maybe slightly more, before she would sink. The exact time was uncertain, but the conclusion was not. Titanic was going down. On deck, however, the ship still looked normal. The lights were on. The air was cold but calm. The ocean was quiet. Passengers were still inside, some asleep, some reading, some talking. The ship had barely changed its posture. This mismatch between appearance and reality is one of the defining features of the Titanic disaster. The ship was fatally wounded, but it did not look wounded. Captain Smith ordered the lifeboats uncovered and prepared. Officers and crew began the process of waking passengers, gathering them, and moving them toward the boat deck. Wireless operators were instructed to send distress signals. The first steps of evacuation began, but at 11:40 p.m., the collision itself was already history. The decisive moment had passed. Titanic's fate had been determined in a few seconds of contact between steel and ice. Everything that followed, every act of courage or confusion, every lifeboat launched or left half empty, unfolded inside the narrowing window created by physics and cold water. In the next chapter, we will examine the damage assessment in detail, including the ship's watertight design, the specific compartments affected, the engineering response below deck, and the slow, relentless mechanics of how a ship that appeared stable could be mathematically unable to survive. Chapter 4. Watertight compartments, flooding physics, and the engineers below. In the minutes after Titanic struck the iceberg, the most important action did not take place on the open decks where passengers stood in coats and evening wear. It happened below the waterline, in narrow corridors, boiler rooms and mechanical spaces where the ship's survival depended on steel partitions, closing doors, and the decisions of engineers who understood exactly what seawater could do to a vessel of this size. Titanic's design included a system of watertight compartments that in 1912 was considered one of the ship's strongest safety features. The ship was divided into 16 major compartments separated by transverse bulkheads. These bulkheads were intended to contain flooding and prevent it from spreading freely through the hull. If a compartment flooded, the ship could still float as long as the flooding did not exceed the design limits. The tool that made this possible was the watertight door system. Titanic had multiple watertight doors installed in the lower sections of the ship, particularly in the engine and boiler room areas. These doors could be closed from the bridge using electrical controls, and they could also be closed manually by crew in the compartments. When activated, the doors slid down into place, sealing openings between compartments. This system was designed to allow normal movement and work during routine operations, while providing the ability to isolate compartments in an emergency. When First Officer William Murdoch ordered the watertight doors closed, the system functioned as intended. Doors dropped shut, sealing off many of the lower compartment passageways. This was an immediate, correct response. But the success of the system depended not only on doors closing, but on the number of compartments breached and the location of the damage. The iceberg's impact had opened the starboard side of the ship in a way that was not visually dramatic above deck, but was catastrophic below. The damage extended across multiple forward compartments. The precise pattern has been studied through survivor accounts, inquiry testimony, and later examination of the wreck site. The general conclusion is that at least 5 compartments were compromised and likely 6. These included the forepeak tank and several compartments associated with boiler rooms. The reason this number matters is that Titanic was designed to remain afloat with a limited number of adjacent compartments flooded. The Olympic-class design could survive flooding in the first 2 compartments, or in certain configurations up to 4 compartments. But once flooding exceeded that threshold, buoyancy became mathematically impossible to maintain. This is where the lecture becomes technical, because the Titanic's sinking was not primarily a mystery. It was a predictable outcome once the extent of the flooding was known. A ship floats because of buoyancy, the upward force exerted by displaced water. The ship's weight is balanced by the weight of the water it displaces. When seawater enters the ship, it increases the ship's mass without increasing its displacement capacity. The ship sinks lower in the water to displace more water, attempting to regain balance. But as it sinks lower, more openings are submerged, allowing even more water to enter. The process accelerates. The ship's internal subdivision was intended to interrupt this cycle. If water could be contained within a small number of compartments, the ship might sink slightly but stabilize. The bulkheads were the walls of that containment system. However, Titanic's bulkheads did not extend all the way to the upper decks. They rose to specific heights, generally to E deck or D deck depending on location, but not to the boat deck. This design allowed for open passenger spaces and operational convenience. It was common in ships of the time, but it created a fatal vulnerability. Once water in a forward compartment rose high enough, it could spill over the top of the bulkhead into the next compartment. This is called progressive flooding. Imagine a series of rectangular containers arranged in a line, separated by walls that do not reach the ceiling. If the first container fills with water, it stays contained until the water level reaches the top of the wall. Once it does, water spills into the next container, which then begins to fill, and the chain continues. Titanic's compartments functioned in a similar way once the ship's bow began dipping lower. The ship's bow dipping lower was not a dramatic plunge at first. It was gradual, but even a small change in angle changes everything. As the bow lowered, the forward compartments filled faster, and the waterline inside the ship rose higher relative to the bulkhead tops. The ship's own posture helped the water climb from compartment to compartment. The engineers below deck faced an immediate crisis. Chief Engineer Joseph Bell was responsible for the engineering department, which included the operation of boilers, engines, pumps, and electrical generators. Bell's staff included men with specialized knowledge of steam systems and mechanical safety. When water began entering boiler rooms, the danger was not only sinking, it was also the risk of catastrophic boiler failure. A boiler under steam pressure is essentially a contained energy system. If cold seawater contacts hot boiler surfaces unevenly, it can cause rapid contraction and stress. If a boiler ruptures, it can explode with deadly force, releasing scalding steam and debris. Engineers had to shut down boilers carefully, vent steam, and manage pressure to avoid sudden failure. This required calm, training, and time. Titanic's electrical power system depended on steam-driven generators, known as dynamos, located in the ship's lower spaces. Maintaining electricity was crucial for lighting, communication, and the ability to operate equipment. Titanic's lights remained on for much of the sinking, which has been described by survivors as eerie and almost comforting. But that power did not remain by accident. It was maintained by engineers who stayed at their posts. The pumps on board were activated to remove water, but pumps have limits. They are designed for manageable flooding, not for a ship open to the sea across multiple compartments. The inflow rate from the iceberg damage far exceeded what pumps could handle. It is likely that tens of thousands of gallons per minute were entering the ship, overwhelming the pumping capacity. Even if every pump worked perfectly, they could not reverse the process. As water rose in the forward compartments, crew members began to realize the severity. The ship's carpenter, James Hutchinson, had a role in assessing damage, including sounding the ship's compartments and checking flooding levels. Reports came back to the bridge. Captain Edward Smith needed a clear understanding of the situation, and the most important assessment came from Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer. Andrews was uniquely positioned to interpret what the damage meant. He knew the compartment design and the limits of survivability. As he inspected the ship, he concluded that Titanic was doomed. His estimate of time remaining varied in accounts, but generally fell in the range of 1 to 2 hours, perhaps a bit longer. The exact number was less important than the conclusion. Titanic was going to sink. This moment is crucial because it marks the shift from damage control to evacuation. A ship can survive many kinds of accidents if time and containment are possible. But once Andrews delivered his assessment, the situation became a race against time, with lifeboat capacity already insufficient. As the ship's bow lowered further, the angle of the deck became noticeable. Passengers walking along corridors could feel a slight tilt. Some noticed that doors did not swing normally. Others saw water in lower passageways. But many still did not understand what was happening. Titanic's structure hid the disaster. The flooding was mostly below, out of sight. The ship's interior lighting remained bright. Music still played in some areas. The world looked normal even as the ship's buoyancy was being mathematically erased. The technical reality of progressive flooding meant that Titanic's fate was sealed early. Once enough compartments were compromised, the sinking could not be stopped by human effort. The engineers could slow certain dangers, like boiler failure, and maintain power longer. The watertight doors could contain some areas temporarily, but the overall trajectory was irreversible. There is also the structural factor. As the bow sank and the stern remained higher, the ship's hull began experiencing increasing stress. Titanic was designed to float evenly, supported by buoyancy along her length. As the bow became submerged, the distribution of support changed. The ship began to bend under its own weight, though the final structural failure would come later. In these early stages, the bending was subtle, but the forces were building. On the boat deck, officers began preparing lifeboats. The davits, mechanical arms used to lower boats, were swung outward. Covers were removed. Crew members were assigned to specific boats. Passengers were called up. But the process was slow, and confusion was widespread. Many passengers resisted leaving the ship. Some refused outright. Others waited for more information. They were being asked to step into small wooden boats on a freezing ocean, in the dark, while the ship itself still looked safe. This is a common human response to disaster. People hesitate when the threat is not visible. They hesitate when the environment still feels stable. Titanic's sinking was not a sudden explosion. It was a slow, quiet infiltration of water into steel compartments. It did not feel like catastrophe until it was too late. Below deck, the engineering staff continued their work. Their actions gave Titanic more time than she might otherwise have had. Keeping the lights on, maintaining communications, and managing steam pressure allowed evacuation efforts to continue longer. But time was still limited. Every minute the bow sank lower, the chain of progressive flooding advanced. In the next chapter, we will focus on the evacuation itself, the lifeboats, the officers in charge, the launch procedures, the decisions about who boarded and when, and the human factors that caused many boats to leave partially empty, even as the ship carried more than 2,000 people. Chapter 5. Lifeboats, Officers, and the Evacuation System Under Stress. Once Captain Edward John Smith accepted that Titanic would not survive, the ship entered its true crisis phase, evacuation. The engineering battle below deck was no longer about saving the ship, but about buying time. The battle above deck was about converting time into lives saved. That conversion depended on tools, procedures, leadership, and the ability of frightened people to act rationally in freezing darkness. The central tool of evacuation was the lifeboat system, and Titanic's lifeboat system was both advanced and deeply inadequate. Titanic carried 20 lifeboats total. 14 were standard wooden lifeboats, each with a capacity of about 65 people. 2 were smaller cutters, often used for utility purposes, each holding roughly 40. 4 were collapsible Engelhardt boats, designed with canvas sides that could be raised, each with a capacity of about 47. Combined, this gave Titanic lifeboat space for approximately 1,178 people. Titanic, 200 people, including passengers and crew. Even under perfect conditions, with every boat launched at full capacity, Titanic could not save everyone. This was not a hidden flaw. It was a known limitation, accepted by the regulatory environment of the time. The British Board of Trade lifeboat requirements were outdated and based on tonnage categories that had not been updated to match the size of modern liners. Titanic technically exceeded the minimum legal requirement. But legality is not the same as adequacy. The lifeboats were mounted on davits, which were mechanical arms that swung outward and lowered boats down the side of the ship. Titanic used a davit design capable of handling more lifeboats than were actually carried. This detail matters because it means Titanic could have been equipped with more lifeboats without completely redesigning the deck. The ship had the physical ability to carry additional boats. The decision not to do so was shaped by a combination of aesthetics, deck space, passenger experience, and the belief that lifeboats were not meant for full ship evacuation. In 1912, the dominant assumption was that in an emergency, a nearby ship would respond, and lifeboats would act as shuttles, ferrying passengers to safety. The North Atlantic at night, surrounded by ice, would expose how fragile that assumption was. Evacuation procedures were led by Titanic's deck officers, each with defined authority. On the port side, Second Officer Charles Lightoller took command of launching boats. On the starboard side, First Officer William Murdoch managed lifeboat operations. Chief Officer Henry Tingle Wild, as the senior deck officer, played a role in coordinating overall efforts. Captain Smith moved between the bridge and the deck, issuing orders and attempting to maintain control. A crucial detail in Titanic's evacuation was the interpretation of women and children first. This phrase is often repeated, but its meaning was not standardized. Lightoller interpreted it strictly. On the port side, he generally allowed women and children to board first, and he was reluctant to permit men to enter boats unless there were no women or children present. Murdoch's approach on the starboard side was more flexible. If no women and children were immediately available, he sometimes allowed men to board to avoid wasting time and leaving boats underfilled. This difference in interpretation produced real differences in boat occupancy and survival patterns. It also created confusion, because passengers could see different rules being applied depending on where they were standing. Another key factor was disbelief. Many passengers did not believe Titanic was sinking. The ship was still lit. The deck was stable enough to walk on. The ocean was calm. There was no visible catastrophe, only cold air and a strange sense of interruption. Some passengers were awakened by stewards and told to put on life jackets, but they were not given a clear explanation. Others came to the boat deck out of curiosity rather than urgency. In disasters, humans often delay action until the threat is undeniable. Titanic's sinking offered just enough normalcy to encourage hesitation. The early lifeboats left with shockingly few people aboard. Lifeboat 7, one of the first launched, departed with roughly 28 people, despite being able to hold about 65. Lifeboat 5 left with about 41. Lifeboat 1, a small cutter with capacity around 40, reportedly left with only about 12. These numbers are among the most tragic technical details of the sinking. Every empty seat represented a life that could have been saved. Why did lifeboats leave half empty? Several reasons overlap. Some passengers refused to board, unwilling to leave the ship. Some crew feared that fully loaded boats might buckle under weight, or that the davits might fail. Others worried that a crowded boat could be swamped when lowered to the water. There was also the problem of time and organization. The boat deck was not a calm staging area. It was dark, cold, and filled with people asking questions, hesitating and moving unpredictably. The crew's training was also limited. Titanic did not conduct a full lifeboat drill with passengers during the voyage. Some accounts mention that a drill had been planned but was cancelled. Whether cancelled due to weather, schedule, or captain's decision, the result was the same. When the crisis arrived, there was no practiced routine for evacuating over 2,000 people. People had to invent order under pressure. There were also class and location dynamics that shaped who reached the boats. First-class passengers had cabins closer to the boat deck and easier access to information. They were more likely to be told directly by stewards what was happening. Third-class passengers were housed deeper in the ship, farther from the lifeboats, and required to navigate long corridors, staircases, and unfamiliar routes. Some gates and barriers existed as part of class separation policies. The exact extent to which these barriers delayed third-class passengers has been debated, but the overall reality is clear. Third-class passengers faced more physical distance and more confusion. The evacuation also depended on communication tools and signals. The ship's officers and crew used whistles, shouted commands, and physical direction. There were no loudspeakers. There was no centralized public address system. Information moved person to person. That is slow and uneven, especially in a ship where thousands of people speak different languages and have different levels of authority. Meanwhile, in the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride were transmitting distress signals. The distress call initially used CQD, an older distress signal, and later SOS, which was still relatively new. These messages were sent repeatedly with Titanic's position. The radio operators worked under extreme pressure. They were not on deck. They could not see the evacuation. Their world was sound, code, and urgency, listening for responses and sending signals into the darkness. One of the ships that received Titanic's distress calls was the RMS Carpathia, operated by the Cunard Line and commanded by Captain Arthur Henry Rostron. Carpathia was approximately 58 nautical miles away. Rostron responded immediately, ordering his ship turned toward Titanic's position. He pushed Carpathia's engines beyond normal operating limits, shutting off non-essential services to divert steam to propulsion. He posted extra lookouts and prepared his crew to receive survivors. Carpathia's response would become one of the most important factors in the number of lives saved. But even at maximum speed, it would take hours to arrive. Another ship in the region was the SS Californian, commanded by Captain Stanley Lord. Californian was closer than Carpathia, but it had stopped for the night due to ice. Its wireless operator had gone off duty. Californian's crew reportedly saw lights and rockets in the distance, but did not interpret them as distress signals. This failure of recognition and response would become one of the most controversial parts of the Titanic story, examined intensely in later inquiries. Back on Titanic, as time passed, the ship's angle became more pronounced. The bow sank deeper. The stern rose slightly. The cold became sharper. Lifeboats continued launching, each one a small piece of the ship's survival capacity leaving into darkness. The officers had to balance speed with order. Launch too quickly, and chaos could lead to boats being improperly loaded or lowered. Launch too slowly, and the ship would sink with boats still on deck. Some individuals became central to Titanic's story through their actions. Margaret Brown, later called Molly Brown, assisted in her lifeboat and urged returning to pick up survivors. Isidore and Ida Strauss reportedly refused separation, with Ida choosing to stay with her husband. These stories have become symbolic, but they also reflect real human behavior. In crisis, people cling to loved ones, to dignity, to familiar values. The ship's band, led by Wallace Hartley, is often reported to have played music during the evacuation. The exact details of what was played and for how long remain debated, but multiple survivor accounts support the broader idea that music was present. Whether intended to calm passengers, maintain order, or simply provide a final act of professionalism, the band became part of Titanic's mythos. It also represents a deep psychological truth. Humans use structure and ritual to survive fear, even when the situation is beyond control. As the lifeboats launched, the reality of scarcity became clearer. There were not enough boats. People began to realize that staying on the ship meant death. Panic grew. The mood shifted from disbelief to urgency. Officers used firearms in some cases not primarily to shoot, but to enforce order and prevent the boats from being overwhelmed. This too became part of the controversy, because the use of force in evacuation situations is morally complex, but the officers were attempting to prevent stampedes that could have killed even more people. By the time the later lifeboats were being launched, the ship's deck was slanted. The launching process became more difficult. collapsible boats were prepared. Some were lowered properly, others were floated off as the water rose. Crew members struggled to keep the system functioning as the ship's structure changed beneath them. The evacuation of Titanic was not a single failure. It was an evacuation system built for a world that believed rescue would always be nearby, operating on a ship that looked too stable to be sinking, managed by officers with limited time and limited tools, under conditions of cold, darkness, and disbelief. It was an emergency that revealed how thin the margin is between order and chaos. In the next chapter, we will follow Titanic into the final hour, examining the last lifeboats, the worsening angle of the ship, the structural stresses building in the hull, and the sequence of events that led to the ship's breakup and disappearance beneath the North Atlantic at approximately 2:20 a.m. Chapter 6, The Final Hour, Structural Failure, and the Sinking at 2:20 a.m. By the time Titanic entered its final hour, the disaster had moved beyond uncertainty. The ship's bow was settling deeper into the Atlantic, and the angle of the decks was becoming impossible to ignore. What had begun as a quiet shudder against ice was now a visible physical transformation of the ship itself. The Titanic was no longer simply damaged. It was actively being dismantled by the combined forces of flooding, gravity, and the limits of its own design. In these last stages, the ship's systems were still functioning, but only because engineers and crew continued to fight for them. The lights remained on across much of the vessel. Wireless transmissions continued. The band, according to many accounts, played on. The ship's outward appearance still carried fragments of normal life, even as the internal geometry of the ship was becoming hostile to human movement. The technical reality below deck was relentless. Water had entered multiple forward compartments and progressed beyond the limits of watertight containment. Progressive flooding continued, with water spilling over bulkhead tops as the bow dipped lower. The ship's trim, the balance between bow and stern, was shifting steadily forward. As the bow sank, the stern rose, exposing more of the ship's aft structure to stress. This is where the sinking becomes not only a story of water entering a ship, but a story of structural engineering under extreme load. Titanic's hull was a long, rigid structure designed to distribute forces evenly when floating. The ship's buoyancy acted along its length, supporting the weight of the ship from below. But as the bow became heavily flooded and submerged, buoyancy in the forward portion changed dramatically. The bow was still supported by water, but it was also pulled downward by the weight of seawater filling interior spaces. The stern, meanwhile, was increasingly unsupported, lifted into the air as the ship's center of mass shifted. In mechanical terms, Titanic was experiencing bending moments, stresses that attempt to bend a structure. A ship can experience these stresses in heavy seas, when waves lift and drop different sections of the hull. But Titanic was now experiencing extreme bending stress due to its own sinking posture. The ship was becoming a lever, with the bow down, the stern up, and the midsection bearing enormous strain. As the angle increased, movement on deck became dangerous. Passengers and crew had difficulty standing. People slipped and grabbed railings. Loose objects shifted. Chairs, debris, and equipment slid toward the bow. The deck was no longer a stable platform. It was a tilted surface over an ocean that was lethally cold. The lifeboat situation was nearing its end. Many of the standard lifeboats had already been launched. The remaining boats included the collapsible Engelhardt boats, which were more difficult to deploy because they required assembly and had canvas sides that needed to be raised. As time ran out, the collapsibles became critical. The officers and crew attempted to free them and lower them, but the ship's angle and the crowd pressure made this increasingly chaotic. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, known for his strong personality and assertive command, played a role in launching lifeboats and later in organizing a return to search for survivors in the water. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, on the port side, was involved in the chaotic final attempts to launch collapsible boats. First Officer William Murdoch, on the starboard side, continued managing launches until the end. Many of these men did not survive, and the exact details of their final actions remain uncertain, shaped by survivor testimony and later interpretation. Meanwhile, in the wireless room, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride continued transmitting distress calls. Their work was vital because the rescue depended entirely on other ships receiving Titanic's position and responding quickly. Phillips was reportedly still sending messages even as water approached the wireless room. Bride survived, but Phillips did not. The radio operator's actions represent one of the clearest examples of professional duty under extreme threat, because they stayed at their station long after escape would have been the rational choice. Captain Edward Smith's actions in the final hour are remembered through fragments. He gave orders, attempted to coordinate evacuation, and reportedly released crew from duty with words that suggested they should save themselves if possible. Some accounts describe him returning to the bridge, remaining there as the ship went down. Like many Titanic details, the exact sequence is uncertain, but the overall reality is that command structure was collapsing under the weight of time and inevitability. As the bow sank further, the ship's forward decks were now close to the sea. Water reached the base of the superstructure. The first-class areas near the bow became threatened. The grand staircase, once a symbol of luxury, became a conduit for flooding. Water moved upward through corridors and stairwells. The interior spaces that had been designed for comfort now became traps and channels for the sea. The soundscape of the ship changed dramatically in the final stages. Survivors described groaning metal, cracking noises, and sudden booms. Some of these sounds likely came from structural strain, as rivets and steel plates shifted under load. Others may have come from internal equipment breaking free, or from steam being released as engineers shut down boilers and systems. The ship was not only sinking, it was breaking apart internally. The lighting, which had remained steady for much of the sinking, began to flicker. Titanic's electrical power depended on the dynamos, which depended on steam and mechanical operation in lower compartments. As water reached critical areas, the generators could no longer be maintained. The moment power failed, the ship plunged into darkness. This was psychologically devastating. Without lights, the ship became a silhouette against the night sky. The ability to navigate the deck and identify lifeboats became far more difficult. Darkness intensified panic. At approximately 2:18 a.m., Titanic reached a point where structural failure became likely. The bow was deeply submerged, and the stern was raised high. The hull was under extreme bending stress. Modern analysis suggests that the ship likely broke apart in this period, though the exact moment is difficult to pinpoint. Many survivors reported seeing the ship split into two. For decades, this claim was disputed by official inquiries, but later evidence, including the discovery of the wreck, confirmed that Titanic did break apart. The breakup was not a clean snap. It was a violent structural failure under enormous stress. The ship's midsection experienced forces that exceeded the strength of its steel and riveted joints. When the hull separated, the bow section, heavy with flooded compartments, began to descend rapidly. The stern section, momentarily buoyant, may have settled back into the water before sinking separately. This sequence explains why survivors described the stern remaining visible for a short time after the breakup. The sinking itself reached its final moment at approximately 2:20 a.m. on April 15, 1912. Titanic disappeared beneath the surface of the North Atlantic. The ship that had been presented as the peak of modern engineering was gone in less than 3 hours from collision to complete submergence. What followed was, in many ways, worse than the sinking. Hundreds of people were now in the water. The temperature was around 28 degrees Fahrenheit, below the freezing point of freshwater due to salinity. In such conditions, cold shock can occur almost immediately. When a human body enters near freezing water, the involuntary gasp reflex can cause inhalation of water. Panic and disorientation follow. Within minutes, muscle function begins to fail. Hypothermia progresses rapidly. Even strong swimmers cannot fight the cold. Survival time without flotation or protection is often measured in minutes. The lifeboats, scattered across the dark ocean, heard screams. Many boats did not return immediately. The fear was that if a lifeboat approached a mass of desperate swimmers, the boat could be swamped and overturned, killing everyone in it. This fear was not irrational. A lifeboat, overloaded beyond its stability limits, could capsize easily. But the consequence of hesitation was devastating. The cries in the darkness faded as the cold claimed people one by one. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe eventually organized a return. He transferred passengers between boats to free space, then took Lifeboat 14 back toward the site where people were in the water. By the time Lowe returned, most were already dead. Only a handful were rescued from the sea. This detail is one of the most painful realities of Titanic. The ocean did not need hours. It needed minutes. The ship was gone, but debris remained. Wooden panels, furniture, and fragments floated. Some people clung to wreckage, others drifted. The lifeboats themselves were small islands of survival, but they were exposed to cold, darkness, and uncertainty. Survivors sat in shock, listening, watching the horizon, waiting for rescue that might not come. In the next chapter, we will follow the rescue response in detail, focusing on the RMS Carpathia and Captain Arthur Rostron's actions, the failures and controversies surrounding the SS Californian, and the immediate aftermath as survivors were brought aboard, counted, and carried toward New York, while the world struggled to understand what had happened. Chapter 7. Rescue by Carpathia, the Californian Controversy, and the World Reacts. When Titanic disappeared beneath the surface at approximately 2:20 a.m., the disaster did not end. It changed form. The ship was gone, but the ocean was now filled with lifeboats, debris, and survivors scattered across darkness and ice-cold water. For the people in the boats, the immediate reality was not history or investigation. It was shock, exposure, and the terrifying question of whether anyone was coming. The most important rescue response came from the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard Line passenger ship commanded by Captain Arthur Henry Rostron. Carpathia was not a giant liner like Titanic. She was smaller, slower, and built for a different kind of service. But on the night of April 14 into April 15, Rostron's decisions and the discipline of his crew became the difference between life and death for hundreds. Carpathia received Titanic's distress calls through wireless telegraphy. Titanic's radio operators, Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, had transmitted CQD and SOS signals, including the ship's position. Carpathia's wireless operator, Harold Cottam, was the one who received the messages. This detail matters because it shows how rescue depended on individuals. If Cottam had been asleep, if his equipment had been off, if the signal had been missed, the outcome could have been even worse. When Cottam informed Captain Rostron, Rostron reacted immediately. He ordered Carpathia turn toward Titanic's position. This was not a casual decision. The waters were known to contain ice. Changing course meant risking Carpathia itself. Rostron had to decide whether to place his own ship in danger to attempt a rescue. He chose to do it without hesitation. Rostron also took aggressive technical measures to maximize speed. He ordered the ship's engineers to push the boilers and engines beyond normal operating limits. He shut down non-essential services to redirect steam to propulsion. Heating in some passenger areas was reduced. Hot water supplies were managed. Every available unit of energy was redirected toward the engines. Rostron posted additional lookouts and instructed the crew to watch constantly for icebergs and pack ice. This was a high-risk maneuver. In an ice field, speed can be dangerous, but Rostron's logic was simple. Every minute mattered. In near-freezing water, survival time for people in the sea could be measured in minutes. Even in lifeboats, exposure could be fatal over hours. Rostron needed to arrive as quickly as possible. Carpathia's crew also prepared for rescue. Blankets were gathered. Hot drinks were arranged. Medical staff were readied. Extra lighting was prepared for the decks. Ladders, ropes, and assistance teams were organized. Rostron treated the situation like a full-scale emergency response, not a routine passenger pickup. Carpathia arrived at the scene at around 4 a.m. By then, Titanic was gone. The first sight was lifeboats in the darkness, some barely visible, some carrying survivors huddled together in silence. There were also floating pieces of debris, but the field of wreckage was not as dense as people sometimes imagine. Much of Titanic had sunk quickly. What remained was scattered. Rescue began boat by boat. Lifeboats approached Carpathia cautiously. Survivors were pulled up by ropes and ladders. Some were too weak to climb and had to be lifted. Many were suffering from hypothermia and shock. Their hands were numb. Their speech was slow. Some were crying. Others were strangely quiet, emotionally shut down by trauma. Carpathia ultimately rescued about 705 survivors. This number, compared to the more than 1,500 who died, highlights the scale of the catastrophe. But it also shows that without Carpathia's immediate and aggressive response, the death toll could have been even higher. Survivors in lifeboats still faced hours of cold exposure. Some would have died even after escaping the ship if rescue had been delayed. As survivors were brought aboard, Carpathia's crew attempted to identify them, count them, and provide basic care. Names were taken. Passengers were separated by condition. The ship's dining areas and public spaces became improvised medical and recovery zones. The emotional atmosphere was chaotic. Some survivors searched for family members. Others asked repeatedly if more people had been rescued. Many could not comprehend that Titanic was completely gone. At the same time, the tragedy of those left behind became clearer. Survivors realized how many lifeboats had left half empty. They realized how many people were missing. They realized that the cries in the water had faded. Some survivors later described the silence after the screams stopped as one of the most haunting sounds of their lives. While Carpathia performed rescue, another ship's role became one of the most controversial elements of the entire event, the SS Californian. Californian was a merchant vessel commanded by Captain Stanley Lord. On the night Titanic struck the iceberg, Californian had stopped due to ice. Its crew had observed ice fields and decided it was safer to halt until daylight. This decision by itself was reasonable, but Californian's wireless operator had gone off duty for the night. As a result, Californian did not receive Titanic's distress calls in real time. The controversy centers on what Californian's crew saw and how they interpreted it. Crew members reportedly saw lights in the distance and observed rockets being fired. On ships, rockets can signal distress, but interpretation depends on training, expectation, and context. Californian's officers did not respond with urgency. They did not wake the wireless operator. They did not immediately steam toward the rockets. Later inquiries questioned whether Californian could have reached Titanic in time to save more lives. This question became emotionally explosive. In the aftermath of a disaster, people look for points where the outcome might have changed. Californian became one of those points. Captain Lord defended his actions, arguing that the rockets were not clearly identified as distress signals and that the ship seen in the distance may not have been Titanic. But many investigators and historians concluded that Californian was likely close enough that a faster response could have saved additional lives. It is important to say this carefully because maritime navigation at night is complex. Distances can be deceptive. The horizon hides ships. Lights can be misread. But the broader lesson remains: Titanic exposed how fragile rescue networks were when communication protocols were inconsistent and responsibility was unclear. As Carpathia began its journey toward New York, the world learned what had happened through wireless communication. News traveled rapidly. Newspapers printed early reports that were sometimes inaccurate, including false claims that Titanic was being towed to safety. This confusion reflects the limitations of early 20th century information systems. Even with wireless, facts were incomplete, messages were delayed, and rumors spread easily. In New York City, families gathered at the White Star Line offices and at the pier where survivors were expected to arrive. People waited for lists. They scanned names. They begged for information. This is another brutal aspect of Titanic. The disaster unfolded in the ocean, but its emotional consequences unfolded on land, in offices, waiting rooms, and homes where people did not yet know who was alive. Carpathia arrived in New York on April 18, 1912. The ship approached Pier 54 and crowds watched in silence. Survivors disembarked into a world that already understood the event as historic. Photographers captured images. Reporters asked questions. Some survivors avoided attention. Others were unable to escape it. For many, the moment of stepping onto land did not bring relief. It brought a new kind of shock because it forced them to confront the scale of loss. Immediately, investigations began. In the United States, a Senate inquiry was led by Senator William Alden Smith. This inquiry took testimony from survivors, crew, and experts. It examined the lifeboat shortage, the speed maintained in ice conditions, the handling of ice warnings, and the failure of nearby ships to respond. In Britain, the Wreck Commissioner's inquiry conducted a parallel investigation focusing on regulations, ship design, and accountability. The inquiries highlighted systemic failures. Lifeboat regulations were outdated. Wireless procedures were inconsistent. Training for evacuation was insufficient. Titanic was not the first ship to face ice danger, but it was the ship that proved how catastrophic the consequences could be when assumptions failed at the worst moment. The Titanic disaster also produced a cultural shock. Titanic was seen as the symbol of modern engineering, a ship that represented safety and confidence. Its loss challenged the belief that technology could eliminate risk. In the Edwardian era, progress was often treated as inevitable. Titanic showed that progress could be fragile and that nature could still overpower human systems. Survivors carried their experiences into the rest of their lives. Some spoke openly, others remained silent. Some were haunted by guilt, especially those who survived when others did not. Crew members faced scrutiny. Officers who survived, like Charles Lightoller, became central figures in testimony and public debate. The disaster created heroes and villains in public imagination, but the reality was more complex. It was a system failure, not a single person's mistake. Carpathia's rescue remains one of the clearest examples of effective emergency response in the story. Captain Rostron's rapid decision-making, technical prioritization, and crew readiness saved hundreds. But even that success cannot hide the deeper truth. Titanic's evacuation system was designed for a world that did not fully accept the possibility of total loss. In the next chapter, we will examine the legacy of Titanic in technical and regulatory terms, including the creation of SOLAS, the International Ice Patrol, changes in lifeboat requirements, continuous wireless watch standards, and what deep-sea exploration later revealed about the wreck itself and the science of its decay on the ocean floor. Chapter 8, SOLAS, Ice Patrol, the wreck, and what Titanic changed forever. The Titanic disaster did not simply kill over 1,500 people and vanish into the Atlantic. It triggered a long chain of consequences that reshaped maritime safety, international regulation, and even how humanity thinks about technology itself. Titanic became a case study in systems failure, a ship built with impressive tools, operating within outdated rules, guided by cultural assumptions that collapsed under the pressure of a single night in ice. When the survivors reached New York aboard the RMS Carpathia, the world's attention shifted rapidly from grief to accountability. The public demanded answers. Governments demanded explanations. The shipping industry, facing reputational damage and potential financial consequences, was forced to confront uncomfortable truths. Titanic was not simply unlucky. Titanic was, in multiple ways, a predictable outcome of a system that had not evolved quickly enough to match the scale of its own inventions. Two major investigations followed. In the United States, the Senate inquiry was led by Senator William Alden Smith. In Britain, the official inquiry was conducted by the Wreck Commissioner, with Lord Mersey presiding. These investigations gathered testimony from survivors, crew, and experts, including officers such as Second Officer Charles Lightoller, who survived and became one of the most important witnesses. The inquiries examined a wide range of factors: the lifeboat shortage, the speed maintained in ice conditions, the handling of ice warnings, the wireless procedures, and the failures of nearby ships to respond. The findings pointed towards systemic problems rather than a single dramatic cause. Titanic struck an iceberg, yes, but the iceberg was only the initiating event. The catastrophe was shaped by the ship's design limitations, the absence of enough lifeboats, the lack of effective evacuation drills, and the inconsistent use of wireless communication as a safety tool. One of the most immediate reforms was lifeboat regulation. Before Titanic, lifeboat requirements were based on tonnage categories that were outdated and did not scale with modern ship size. Titanic carried more lifeboats than the minimum required by the British Board of Trade, yet still had capacity for only about half the people on board. This exposed the absurdity of the regulations. After Titanic, the principle became far more direct. Ships must carry enough lifeboat space for everyone on board, passengers and crew. This shift sounds obvious now, but at the time it represented a major change in philosophy. It required shipping companies to sacrifice deck space, accept visual clutter, and invest in more equipment and training. It also forced a change in the psychological model of evacuation. Lifeboats were no longer viewed primarily as ferries to a nearby rescue ship. They were treated as true survival craft for total abandonment. Another critical reform involved lifeboat drills and crew training. Titanic's crew did not conduct a full passenger lifeboat drill during the voyage. This meant that passengers did not know where to go. Crew members were forced to improvise, and the launching process began slowly and inconsistently. After Titanic, drills became mandatory. Procedures were standardized. Passenger instruction became a formal part of ship operations. The goal was to reduce hesitation and confusion in emergencies where minutes matter. Wireless communication protocols were also transformed. Titanic's distress calls were heard by the Carpathia, which responded quickly, but the nearby SS Californian did not respond effectively, in part because its wireless operator had gone off duty. This revealed a fatal weakness. Wireless, one of the most powerful tools of the era, was not being used as a continuous safety service. After Titanic, ships were required to maintain continuous wireless watch, ensuring that distress calls could be received at any hour. This created a more reliable rescue network and reduced the chance that a ship could be close enough to help yet remain unaware. The Titanic disaster also led directly to the establishment of the International Ice Patrol. This organization, operated under international cooperation, monitors iceberg danger in the North Atlantic and provides warnings to ships. The Ice Patrol uses surveillance methods that evolved over time, including ship patrols, aircraft observation, and modern satellite and radar systems. Its purpose is simple: prevent another Titanic by ensuring that ice hazards are tracked and communicated clearly. Perhaps the most significant regulatory outcome was the creation of the International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, known as SOLAS. SOLAS became the foundation for modern maritime safety standards. It addressed lifeboats, emergency procedures, ship construction requirements, navigation safety, and communication protocols. Titanic was not the only disaster that shaped maritime law, but it was the disaster that forced the world to act quickly and decisively. These changes represent the technical legacy of Titanic: improved tools, improved rules, and improved training. But Titanic's legacy is also cultural. Titanic became a symbol of technological confidence meeting natural reality. In the early 1900s, industrial society often treated engineering progress as a kind of inevitability, as if bigger and stronger machines meant control over the world. Titanic shattered that belief. The ship was enormous, modern, and expensive, yet it could still be destroyed by ice and cold water. For decades after the sinking, the Titanic's final resting place remained unknown. People knew the approximate area, but the ocean is vast, and the North Atlantic seabed is deep and hostile. Titanic sank to a depth of about 12,500 feet, roughly 3,800 meters. At that depth, the environment is extreme. Sunlight does not reach it. Temperatures are near freezing. Pressure is immense, hundreds of times greater than at the surface. The Titanic did not sink into a calm, preserving museum environment. It sank into a world that slowly destroys everything. The wreck was discovered in 1985 by a team led by Dr. Robert Ballard, along with French oceanographer Jean-Louis Michel. The search used advanced tools for deep-sea exploration, including sonar mapping and remotely operated vehicles. The discovery was historic, not only because it confirmed the location, but because it confirmed key details about the sinking itself. One of the most important confirmations was the breakup. For decades, there had been debate over whether Titanic sank intact or broke apart. Many survivors insisted they saw the ship split. Early official conclusions often suggested it sank whole. The wreck resolved the question. Titanic's bow and stern sections were separated on the seabed, with a debris field between them. This confirmed that the ship broke into at least two major pieces during the final minutes. The wreck also revealed how different sections of the ship behaved during descent. The bow section is relatively intact, having descended in a more stable orientation, while the stern section is far more damaged and twisted, likely because it sank with more chaotic movement, structural collapse, and internal air pockets causing unpredictable forces. The debris field contains fragments of the ship's interior, machinery, and personal items, scattered across the seabed like a frozen explosion. Titanic's decay on the ocean floor is itself a technical subject. Steel corrodes in seawater, and the process is accelerated by microorganisms. The wreck is covered in rust formations, often called rusticles, which are created by bacteria that consume iron and produce fragile reddish-brown structures. Over time, these rusticles weaken the ship's metal. Decks collapse. Walls fall inward. The ship is slowly being eaten by chemistry and biology. This matters because Titanic is not permanent. The wreck will eventually collapse into an unrecognizable shape. The Titanic is not being preserved by the ocean. It is being erased by it. Every expedition that visits the wreck faces an ethical question: documentation versus disturbance. Submersibles can damage fragile structures. Lights and contact can break pieces. Even small impacts can accelerate decay. The wreck is both a historical artifact and a gravesite, and that dual identity shapes how people argue about exploration. Titanic's story also changed how humans think about safety systems more broadly. One of the clearest lessons is that safety tools are only as effective as the assumptions behind them. Titanic had watertight compartments, but not high enough bulkheads. Titanic had wireless, but not continuous monitoring. Titanic had lifeboats, but not enough for everyone, and not enough training to use them efficiently. The ship was advanced, but its safety system was incomplete. Another lesson is that disasters are rarely caused by one mistake. They are caused by chains of decisions that each seem reasonable in isolation. Titanic maintained speed because that was normal. Ice warnings were treated as routine. Passengers hesitated because the ship looked stable. Lifeboats left half empty because people feared overload and did not believe the danger. The ship sank because progressive flooding exceeded design limits. Each step alone seems explainable. Together, they became fatal. Titanic also forced the world to confront the human element in engineering. You can build a powerful machine, but you cannot remove human psychology. People deny danger. People hesitate. People follow social rules even when those rules cost time. People wait for authority to tell them what to do. Titanic's evacuation was shaped as much by disbelief and class structure as by steel and ice. And finally, Titanic became a story of individual roles and decisions under pressure. Captain Edward Smith, First Officer William Murdoch, Second Officer Charles Lightoller, Chief Engineer Joseph Bell, wireless operators Jack Phillips and Harold Bride, designer Thomas Andrews, and Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia all became central figures because their jobs placed them at critical points in the system. Titanic is not just the story of passengers. It is the story of professionals operating tools and procedures in a moment where the margin for error vanished. When people talk about Titanic today, they often focus on romance, luxury, or myth. But the deeper reality is more instructive and more unsettling. Titanic was a modern system that failed in predictable ways when stressed beyond its design assumptions. The reforms that followed were not simply reactions to tragedy. They were acknowledgments that the world had changed, and safety needed to change with it. And that is Titanic's lasting legacy, not only the image of a ship disappearing into black water, but the quiet, technical truth that progress without updated safety culture is fragile. The ocean does not negotiate with confidence. It does not care about prestige or schedules. It responds only to physics. And on a calm, moonless night in April 1912, physics won. And that brings us to the end of tonight's midnight lesson on the sinking of the RMS Titanic. If you enjoyed this and want more calm, in-depth lectures to fall asleep to, please subscribe and check back for the next episode. And if you have any topic requests for future videos, leave them in the comments. I'm always looking for new ideas. Good night, and I'll see you in the next lesson.